because of their size or age, has the potential for generating significant amounts of methane. However, only about 220 of those fall under ARB's early methane control measure, because other ones are a little too smaller, they're a little older. They'll produce methane, but not high enough quantities to need control. Reason landfills are important in the greenhouse gas area is that it's the second largest anthropogenic source of methane in California, number one being agriculture. And there's only two ways for greenhouse gas reductions from landfills. One is less organic waste going into the landfills, so you have less methane being produced, or two, better control of methane that's already being produced in the landfill, such as increased landfill gas collection. Next. Some of these have been mentioned before, some of the policy drivers behind greenhouse gases. The first two, AB 32 and AB 341, kind of deal more with parts of reducing the organics going to the landfills, while the last two are dealing more with more incentives for landfill owners, maybe moving from flaring of landfill gas to actually more productive use of the landfill gas. Okay, next slide. There's a number of challenges doing with the landfills. Some of these have been mentioned before in some of the other papers, such as markets. If you recycle more material from the landfills, that has to go somewhere, and is there a market for that eventual product? Other thing, if you incentivize a different way of landfill gas instead of flaring, going to compressed natural gas, liquefied natural gas, or electricity production, there has to be a market for those products too. So there's one of the challenges. As we mentioned, also uncertainty in the emissions. There's a number of different models out there, different assumptions, how much gas is being produced in a landfill, how much is being, what's the collection efficiency, what's the other factors, and so better data and more accurate data would help in narrowing the ranges of those, what the actual emissions could be, so when you compare it to other options, you have a better idea of how better a different option may be. Implementation of BMPs. BMPs have been developed. A couple examples are thicker intermediate cover or early closures will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from landfills. But the challenge is getting landfill owners to implement those best management practices and show that that's a good thing for them to do. And also another challenge is that ARB is looking at potentially lowering their the surface emission limit from 500 to possibly 200 to another incentive to provide more gas collection. Next slide. Some of the solutions out there are some regulatory, potentially making the implementation of BMPs mandatory. Another regulatory is, as I've mentioned, the surface emission limit, make it a tighter limit. And third is, as mentioned under the thermal treatment, is including landfills under cap and trade potentially, or limiting the amount of organics that could go to landfills possibly down to zero. Other solutions, there's incentives for either markets for the recycled material or markets for the landfill gas products to make those more cost effective. And then also further research and other data collection to have a better idea of what the actual benefit for emissions from the landfills or reduction of moving waste out of the landfills, what the actual reduction in greenhouse gases would be. Next. I think turn it back over to Howard for the final wrap up.
Okay, we're almost done with our presentation. The last couple of slides, I want to turn your attention to one of the other papers that was provided to you on Friday, and that is a matrix. It's called Appendix C Waste Sector Implementation Plan. It's about 4 pages, and it lists a lot of the activities or solutions that you've already heard of in the various papers today and just given in highlights by our various presenters. So that's a draft matrix. It is trying to at least show you that there are a lot of actions or potential solutions that are on the table and being considered. Some of those are things that are already ongoing. You know, we are already doing work on more emission reduction factors and low carbon fuel standards. We also are seeking funding. As you all know, the cap and trade revenues were not provided this for the fiscal year 13-14 as of yet, but that's an issue that continues to be discussed. So there are a lot of things that are ongoing that are listed in that matrix. And so you won't see a lot of specific dates, but there are indications of what's short-term kind of things that are either working on now or coming up in the next year or so, versus some of the things that may be considered over the longer term. So we're going to be asking you for input on that. That's a very dynamic document. It's intended to be a work in progress and sort of keep track for us and for you of what's going on. So let me go ahead to next step. So to wrap up, what we'd like to, that's okay, Dan, I got it. When I finish up, we're going to go ahead and open up the discussion to you. The next steps are to take your input. Both today, we'll take as many notes as we can, and we'd prefer to get comments in writing to the extent that you're able to, because that gives us assurance that we heard you or see exactly what you wanted to say, rather than us writing some notes and then trying to interpret it later. So comments in writing by July 12th are requested. We will take those comments jointly from the Air Board and CalRecycle and consider them and see how we want to change the plan, the waste sector plan. In terms of additional opportunities for feedback, the Air Resources Board has 3 workshops scheduled in June and July on the overall scoping plan update. It'll be somewhat similar to what was done last week, where all the sectors were presenting. These are around the state. The next one is June 26th down in Diamond Bar, and there are 2 in July. One is in Fresno, I believe, and one is in the Bay Area, and those are listed on the Air Board site. There also will be likely additional opportunities to comment on the scoping plan in talking with Dan and others at the Air Resources Board. There'll probably be an August or September version of the actual scoping plan update that you'll be able to comment on, and that's slated to go to the Air Resources Board for consideration and adoption in November of this year. So that's sort of the time frame for the scoping plan. As we've said from Carol and Edie on through all of us who have presented, there's a very clear nexus between the work we do on the scoping plan and AB 341's 75% goal. So that work continues within CalRecycle. We had workshops last year where we got comments from many of you. Those comments are still being considered and vetted, and there'll be additional opportunities for input on that. The next opportunity is a workshop. I don't think we have the exact date yet, but sometime in July, probably down in Southern California, on one of the more controversial issues, which is performance standards related to material recovery facilities. Both the provision in AB 341 about, quote, comparable to source separation, unquote, and also whether performance standards can help inform when compostable and recyclable materials have been removed from the waste stream to a sufficient degree that the remaining material might be used for other purposes such as energy recovery. So that's been one of the more controversial issues in 341. The 75% work, you saw it referred to here as well. So the nexus is very tight between these two activities, and so you'll see a lot of back and forth. The information that we get today is definitely going to feed into the 341 report. We also, just with respect to 341 and the 75% report, there are a number of bills that are of great import to what happens on the 75% statewide goal. Some of them are still active. Some of them may be active in the next couple of months. So we're watching that to see what happens. And that will also certainly flavor what we put into that final 75% report. So I think let's go to the last slide and just list that email. Dan, is there anything else you want to add, or we're good? Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're only 2.5 minutes behind our actual posted agenda, which is pretty good, guys. Congratulations. We're going to open it up. There is opportunity. I know that the audio has not been great for those of you who are listening, so I apologize. Hopefully someday this building will get a update into the 21st century in terms of its webinar and conferencing capabilities. But if you have a question or a comment, you can at least provide it to us at climatechange@calrecycle.ca.gov. What we'll do is we'll go around for folks who are here in the room. and get comments for about half hour. We'll see how things are going. And then I'll see what kind of comments we have on email, so we'll kind of go back and forth. We've got roving mics. I'll try to watch and keep a queue and move it around. When you get the mic, it usually there's about a second delay if somebody turned it off. Don't get thrown by that like I got thrown by the mouse earlier. Speak very closely into it so that folks on the listening in on the audio can hear. And please state your name and your affiliation. And you can make several comments. You know, if you start going on for about 5 minutes, excuse me if I cut you off and move on to somebody else. I don't want to do that. But we want to make sure everybody has a chance to say something. And then if we have nobody else wants to say anything, you want to add a comment or elaborate on an earlier comment, that's A-okay. But let's make sure we hear from everybody as quickly as we can. And then for those of you guys with mics, I noticed ARB folks doing this. If you can just point so I can kind of catch where the speaker is and we can focus our attention, it really helps.
Chuck Helgett, representing Republic Services. I'll just do two at a time because I'm sure I'm going to have a few more comments, Howard. But on your first slide, number 4 in the presentation addressing multiple mandates, I would suggest that perhaps another mandate that we're still struggling under is AB 939 as well, and that the infrastructure that we're dealing with and talking about changing is part of AB 939, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. That's a comment, that wasn't a question. And then a question on slide 14 on processing infrastructure. Is that permitted capacity, or what kind of capacity are we dealing with there? It appears to me to be permitted capacity, and if so, I would submit that permitted capacity isn't necessarily the same as useful capacity, particularly when we're talking about changing the waste stream. It may be absolutely necessary to invest significant amounts of money in that excess capacity in order to make it useful capacity.
To the extent that we can answer questions like that, we'll give it a shot. We may not go into a lot of depth today, but we will try. So I think is that you, Clark?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The information in there is right out of our Facet toolbox, and there's some variability in the data. So you can go to our Facet toolbox, enter one of these facility types, and pull up the list of actual facilities. In some cases, a facility will have gone in there and verified their data with a range of numbers. In other cases, it's an estimated range. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I would encourage you to take a look at that Facet information, the facility-specific information, and if it's one of your facilities, feel free to update the data we have in there. We're really going through and trying to do some data validation and verification with folks whose facilities we have listed within that toolbox.
Evan Edgar, engineer, Edgar Associates for the recycling and compost sector, formerly known as the waste sector. One of the long-range plans was develop a sustainable, low-carbon recycling and compost management system. And the recycling is a system because of the fact that we have collection, processing, and market development and landfilling. And as an engineer for 10 different companies I represent, we do the climate footprint, the greenhouse gas inventory verified by the Climate Registry. As part of that, the typical company has 90% of the emissions on transportation, 10% on energy use from processing, and then we're about 15 to 20 times net zero carbon negative from the avoided indirect emissions from recycling. So being a net zero goal by 2035, we highly support because we're doing that today. If you look at our emissions from collection and processing compared to our avoided indirect emissions as defined in your slide, many of the companies, all 10 I represent at the Climate Registry, we are net zero today. So that's a good goal to have today. As part of that, I'd be remiss if not mentioning the collection system. With CARB being at the table, CARB had a lot of influence on heavy-duty vehicle regulation and inspired our industry early on to move from diesel to CNG. There are 15,000 collection heavy-duty trucks in California, with over 2,000 being on CNG, with many more in the future. For each truck that we put from diesel to CNG, we're at 22% greenhouse gas reduction per truck. So many of our companies with verified carbon footprints have made that change, and we have 15 to 20% reduction today from our emissions by doing CNG. But the big aspect of collection for the long-term developable, sustainable, low-carbon management system is making our own fuel out of biomethane via AD. Within the compost sector, you do mention about biomethane, but the biggest play, and this is what I talked about during the cap and trade as well, is making biofuels. That's a great opportunity to have a carbon negative fleet. And that should be actually a headline or a highlight within a PowerPoint presentation, where the first carbon negative fleet will be online in early 2014 with the help of the California Energy Commission grants. We need AB 18 expanded in order to fund more of these AD facilities to get for the incentive so we can deploy this technology. Dr. Levison is entirely correct. We have the technology. We need to deploy the technology. So on behalf of the collection industry, I would like to at least have some mention about the collection aspects of collecting the recyclables and organics, that right now we have a huge play on CNG for greenhouse gas reductions. We can make our own fuel, and the goal by 2020 and 2035 could be a carbon negative fleet for the 15,000 trucks out there collecting the organics and the recyclables. Thank you.
Let's piggyback to the other side of the room, Elena, if there's anybody. Otherwise, just work up the rows and come back down the road. We got a lot right on the aisles here. We'll get to you all, folks. Mike.
Good afternoon. Michael Tarue, JDMT. We have a rather amazing opportunity really here, and I applaud the depth of work that's obvious in the documents that have been produced. I would bring attention to two encoded tests that we can use across the entire range of this work. The first is the legal definition of recycling in PRC 40180, and the second are the legally mandated mechanisms that we are to use for life cycle assessment, management, and accounting of greenhouse gases. If we understand that recycling is a pathway with a starting and an end point, collect, sort, clean, treat, reconstitute, and at the point of reconstituting, not at remanufacturing, at reconstituting, we meet the specifications of either reuse or remanufacturing. At that point, that reconstituting facility creates a non-waste out of a material that was a waste and completes the process of recycling. That is a test. Has this recycling pathway that we're observing completed that pathway? Has it actually reconstituted those materials either for the specifications of reuse or remanufacturing? I find that we're mixing terms consistently here and pushing remanufacturing in. It's true, all of these steps can be pushed into one complex, they're one continuum, but they can also be individual processes in a complex, or indeed they can start at one side of the country and end up on the other side of the world. And the transport distances, thank you, Evan, are very crucial to that. If we are to use life cycle assessment counting for greenhouse gases, then each of these steps must have its own accounting. We can't make the basic assumptions that we can compare, for example, just the landfill to just the processing facility. Indeed, that's an infrastructure question on both. Curiously, we've got 300 and something landfills scattered all over the country because they're very close to where the waste is generated, and we have very few reprocessing facilities. So at the moment, we have a disparity that means that you're going to have to truck the stuff further to reprocessing sites than you are to get them to a landfill. If we are indeed going to pursue incremental greenhouse gas reductions, the nature of that transport, the distances, the locations, must be accounted for. We need to know where that happens. I'll leave my comments at that. I will be submitting detailed written comments.
Thanks, Michael. I think we all appreciate the complexities of the life cycle associated with material movement and transportation. That's something that in developing emission reduction factors, for example, we do take into account. Whether we do it sufficiently or not, absolutely open for discussion. Frank, I think you have the mic.
Frank Capone, LA County Sanitation Districts. A question first off, how will all this be used in the upcoming scoping plan? For example, will the 20 to 30 million metric tons be a factor that's used for emission reductions in the scoping plan?
Dan Donahue, ARB. I don't know right now. I mean, what we're focusing on, that, you know, there's two things we're really focusing on. One of the things about this portion, this sector, is that as compared to the other elements within the scoping plan, we really are focusing on what's happening between now and 2020, whereas most of the other sectors are focusing on the future. To the extent that we identify through this process that there are certain goals that can be achieved, and identify what we think the emission reductions are going to be associated with those GHG reductions, we will identify those. With respect to whether this is 20 or 30 or 10 and all that, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think we've identified that in the papers as far as emission reduction factors. We're also going to have to look at, you know, where is the waste going to go? Is it, you know, what difference is it if it goes to composting versus anaerobic digestion and all that? But certainly the scoping plan will identify, will take the information from the waste sector and say, here's where we think we're going to get by the 2020 timeframe, by the 2035 timeframe.
Okay. Just a follow-up to that. This discussion just previously with the previous speaker on life cycle. The original sector paper talked a lot about the use of life cycle, but the 5 papers that followed it didn't really use the term very much. I really would not like to see that get lost in the mix here, because I think it's very important. I agree with Edgar that, or following up on Edgar, he thinks that we're at a zero. We've already achieved zero greenhouse gas or net greenhouse gas reductions, or close to it. I think that's really important to know. Personally, I think that 73 million tons generated, there needs to be a life cycle done around those generation numbers, upstream and downstream. I think we need to know where we're at today. Before we proceed any further with any of this, I think that's an important number to know. If the industry truly is where Edgar thinks we are, I think that kind of gives us an emphasis on how quickly we have to move. If we're already net zero, well, I think we should pat ourselves on the back and say, yeah, there's still more work to be done, but we're doing better than everybody else out there. And I think that's important to know. So I strongly stress that we have to do life cycle up front and get those numbers up front and understand what they are, because we have to know where we are before we get to know where we're going. Just some miscellaneous, and I'll pass this along. There's been a lot of talk about updating emission factors, and it's mainly on emission reduction or greenhouse gas reduction in the landfill sector. I think it's also important to know, and if we're going to do this honestly, we need to know what the greenhouse gas emissions are from a real life compost pile out there. I've been involved in a lot of protocol development, most recently the ICLEI protocols, which were just released. And we time and time again, we come across the same question when we do those protocols. What are the greenhouse gas emissions from compost piles? And we don't know what the answer is to that. The South Coast AQMD has done a really terrific job in estimating criteria pollutant emissions from compost, but we don't have a real good handle on the greenhouse gas emissions. I know at our agency we've done a little work on that, and quite frankly, some of the results we've seen are a little scary. But I think it's important for you guys to do that, not the sanitation districts, because that's where the most credibility will come from. And once again, it has to be real life piles out there, not an ideal pile in some laboratory, because it's important to know what the contribution is before we can honestly say that composting is the preferred standard for organic diversion. I think we all deserve to know that answer. And just very quickly on the landfill portion of this, before we proceed with any further early action measures on landfills, I think it's important to know how effective the original standards were. and we need to see a complete evaluation of that. Our previous committee of landfill folks would be glad to get back together again and work with Ronaldo and the team up there and try to find out what that answer is. But I think before we start talking about more BMPs, going from 500 to 200, we need to know where we are in terms of the effectiveness of the previous measures. Thank you.
Let's, okay, after Chuck, let's get to the back of the room and then work our way front, Chris. So, because we're going to have to keep moving on the comments so everybody has a chance.
Thank you, Harry.
Although everybody's been short and sweet, that's been fine.
As Chuck White with Waste Management. I really appreciate you guys having this workshop today. It really helps us get our arms and heads around what you're proposing to do. I think there's still some more work to be done, and one of the areas I really would like to see is a little more transparency in some of how the numbers were developed. I noticed in a couple of the white papers there were in parens references, but there was no, at least I couldn't find, an attached list of references to follow to see where the numbers came from, so it's kind of hard to do the review. But one example is on slide 8, which is the 2020 goals. And it talks about the AB 341 75% goal. And to achieve 75%, you need to move 22 million tons from landfills. And I know that there was that AB 341 draft report that was put out a couple of months ago. There was quite a bit of discussion about that. Are we to assume that you're basically holding firm to those assumptions you made in putting that initial draft plan together? For example, the issue is what is ADC considered recycling, or is it considered disposal? Which side of the column do you put that in? Are you basing that on existing law or a possible change in law into the future? Right now we're at 66% diversion, with about 30 million tons, at least according to your website, being disposed statewide. It's hard for me to imagine how you'd get to 75% diversion unless you're talking about your 75% recycling that you talked about before as being something different than diversion. Then how would you get to the 22 million tons needed to be diverted from a landfill? And I guess I
can answer it.
I'm not asking for an answer now, Howard.
Well,
but
no, you deserve an answer.
Just a one-pager at some point in time to kind of describe the assumptions you're making and what is recycling, what's diversion.
Chuck, give me a chance to answer.
Okay, go ahead.
The answer is exactly what we portrayed in the earlier documents last year, that we are looking at reuse recycling and not counting things such as ADC, transformation, beneficial reuse. So it is not diversion, and we've been very solid on that course. That's our interpretation of the law, and I know not everybody agrees with that, but that's been a very consistent message.
Okay, so that hasn't changed.
Yeah, Chuck, one thing, Dan Donahue,
Yeah.
I just wanted to respond. You know, as far as the papers, we do plan to include the methodology for the calculations in there. We haven't, done that at this point in time, but as we finalize these papers and look at, there will be appendices that will have calculation methodologies, the assumptions used for any of the things that are critical. That's part of what we plan to do.
And that would be really helpful, and I guess I'm hoping that there'll be additional opportunity to comment once that additional information is provided.
Yes.
Okay. And then the 20 to 30 million metric tons on that same slide, slide 8, of greenhouse gas reductions, I understand it is based on a life cycle assessment, and it isn't necessarily direct emission reductions that are happening in California. It could be result of reduced emissions from a remanufacturing plant in the state of Washington or in the country of China or something like this. I'm a little bit worried about possible double counting. I know that Waste Management prepared had ICF International give us a report on how you would get emission reductions from recycling, and where those emission reductions occur, there could be really opportunity for double counting in doing that. Like, for example, one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas savings from recycling is reduced fuel and electricity demand. Well, some other sector may be also looking at taking advantage of that reduced use of electricity and fuel. And so you really need to be clear on how you're accounting for these emission reductions across the various sectors. And one other example like that is with respect to the forest sector. I think the wood and products forest sector in the ARB overall plan does look at materials that are wood products, for example, that where carbon is being stored, and how does that affect the overall storage of that sector if materials are diverted from landfills. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad idea to divert materials from landfills, but you need to be clear that there isn't double counting of the net reduction that you're getting, or you're reducing in one place, but it's appearing someplace else. And I would just ask for a little greater clarity and visibility on all these assumptions you're making across the board from the waste sector. Thank you very much.
Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California. I want to start by thanking all of you and Scott Smithline and others for really moving out ahead on these issues. I think you're the first sector under the AB 32 scoping plan to do this, and I'm going to have some comments and suggestions for the technical papers, but I think just putting them out there is incredibly helpful to start this conversation sooner rather than later, and really to play a proactive role on this. So I want to start by thanking you for doing that. I think it's really helpful. Then I have a couple general comments and a couple specific comments on two of the specific chapters, and all of my comments are about the organic, non-recyclable part of the waste stream in California. So I think with the organic part of the waste stream, the highest and best use from a carbon standpoint or from a climate standpoint is to use it for energy generation first. And there's a lot of language throughout the plan that refers to composting or anaerobic digestion. And I think, two suggestions, and this is not meant as wordsmithing, but really to guide this going forward, is anaerobic digestion should go first because it has to, and it should always be an and. It never needs to be either or here. So we really need to look at how to prioritize and how to maximize greenhouse gas reductions and savings in this sector, which can be enormous. Then my specific comments are in the AD chapter and in the biomass chapter. In both of those chapters, one of the biggest hurdles the industry faces are new air quality standards. And we're not asking for weaker standards, but we absolutely need help developing the technologies that can cost effectively meet those standards. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot of landfills and a lot of wastewater treatment facilities go back to flaring the gas, which would just really be tragic in this day and age when we so desperately need renewable biogas sources. In addition, we need financial incentives. This is not going to be an easy transition for public agencies or the industry as a whole, especially to get to transportation and low carbon fuels. It is slightly easier right now to do electricity generation because generators can get long-term contracts. There's nothing comparable on the transportation side. And so generators of biogas, landfills, and others are not, for the most part, developing transportation fuels, which again would be the highest and best use of that gas. So we need to look for financial incentives, and whether it's additional offset protocols, Dan, or other sources of funding in this sector, we need the EPIC program to do the R&D and other pilot projects and more deployment and demonstration funds. I think we can get there, and I think it will prove to have enormous benefits, and you obviously understand that already. But we need a roadmap, and that is my overarching comment. Having been a little bit involved in the Bioenergy Action Plan, it was at the 30,000 foot. We really need to drill down now, and I don't mean the drill, baby, drill kind of drill, but we need to get very specific now about the barriers and the incentives that will get us there. And the last thing is we need help from all the state agencies at the Public Utilities Commission. Dan, I know you're involved in the AB 1900 proceeding to make pipeline injection more feasible. We have SB 1122 on the electricity side. We really need Sacramento to come to San Francisco and help us with those proceedings so they do what they were meant to do, because it's not clear right now that they are going to help bioenergy development. Thank you. Oh, I promise I would.
Thanks, Julia. We won't miss you, but I know you're lost up front.
This is Rachel Oster with Recology. I snagged the microphone. Yeah, everything Julia just said, and I just wanted to highlight one important point that Julia said, which is that everything I read in these papers screams development and more facility siting. I mean, we're going to need to do that in order to meet the goals of the scoping plan and of AB 32 in our sector. And the complication is that at the same time we're meeting these goals, we also have competing goals sometimes at different agencies. And so I heard Edie Chang in the beginning say that this is a really great opportunity for two agencies to work together toward one goal. And that's great when you do have one goal, but too often we see when developing organics processing facilities to handle this material that there's competing goals. And so at what point do we engage the air districts into this conversation and say, hey, we have these goals, we're going to need to site more facilities, and we see some competing goals on your end, and how can we come together to achieve both of them? I think that's a really necessary conversation that we need to have here. And it goes beyond just the air districts, but that's just an example.
Yeah, Dan Donahue, ARB. Clearly, we need infrastructure development, and and as we identified, I think the two key issues of infrastructure development is how do we finance them? At least the initial 20% that needs to be out there until we have a critical mass, and then the other thing is how do we site them? That's a broader issue. I mean, one of the areas that we've specifically identified that we have need to begin work on immediately on is with respect to the compost sector, particularly with respect to some of the existing district regulations associated with that, and the need to move that forward. We've identified within ARB just this week a group to begin to work on that. But obviously we're going to need to work directly with the districts and with the water board and CalRecycle on that. So those are going to be done. I think the other thing that's happened is overall on the scoping plan there is going to be much more discussion on how do we get the infrastructure built in the issues associated with siting, and where do you get the offsets to build those. The next group of workshops on the scoping plan are really being held by the districts, and that is an area where I think teeing up these issues is naturally going to occur, and ARB and CAPCOA are going to have committed to sitting down as we get the scoping plan for the various sectors together and see where we what we can do to work together on moving forward on a number of these issues that really are dealing with both the local air pollution agencies and this broader perspective on where we go with respect to the overall scoping plan.
Thank you for that comment. And I just want to follow up by saying that the composting facilities are, aren't going to go away. They are going to deal with the material that's coming out of the back end of the anaerobic digesters and the digestate. And so perhaps the movement of that technology into the infrastructure will help settle some of the air districts' quote unquote issues with composting facilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to the next person, I'll just add to Dan's comments. Of course, Rachel knows that we have worked with air districts for many years on various regulatory proposals, as well as regional boards. And of course, one of the issues is that they have different underlying statutory drivers. Sometimes they're federal. They also don't necessarily recognize the difference between a point source that is managing a material, such as a composting facility, versus what would happen to that material if it was just left out on its own, and some of the trade-offs associated with that, and the calculus of the co-benefits isn't included. So there are a lot of issues that have been explored for a long time, but they're clearly not sufficient information and drivers yet to address them. So I think it's well taken. I think it was Art. Okay. I'm sorry, you have the phone there.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm Julie Ball. I represent the California Biomass Energy Alliance. This is the trade association of the state's solid fuel biomass power facilities. I want to thank you for talking about the term waste, and we don't want to use that word anymore. We've made it a big deal in our organization to ban the word because we spend an awful lot of money on those materials to come to our biomass facilities to generate renewable power. It's definitely not a waste, and we think we should put $1 in the jar every time someone says it and have a little party at the end of the year. But I want to make a point. As I started to read your biomass conversion section, I sort of stopped because the numbers weren't going to add up quite right because you have a little data problem. You missed about 1/3 of the industry on your list of facilities. And I'd be more than happy to help identify where those are and how big they are and what they're doing. Another point I want to make actually is when you talk about the facilities and what they could do to be helpful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I really want you to focus on it's all about the fuel. You can try to find minuscule GHG savings at the facilities themselves. You could try to find some cogeneration benefits, some host facility nearby, but those aren't where your target should be. It should be really getting at the hardest to get, the more expensive, but more environmentally beneficial fuel to get out there. That's the stuff out in the forest, it's the stuff out in the fields that, by the way, have incredible co-benefits, which you didn't quite outline well enough here, with co-pollutants. When you avoid ag burning and forest fires because you're getting those wood residues out of the fields and out of the forest into the facilities, that's where you need to focus your effort. The facilities that exist today, the 34 facilities that are here today, generating 650 megawatts of renewable power, are doing so, as you mentioned, with very poor contracts. And Julia Levin is absolutely right. The PUC is the key to resolving this problem. We're never going to get at all that fuel that's available to us because it's not available economically. So let's focus on the fuel and let's focus on the contracting, because we'll go through the permitting process. We actually don't think the permitting is a problem for the facilities that our members are developing. The air quality regulations are not a problem. But getting a contract that will actually pay us what it costs to build and generate power from a biomass plant is. And we'll, of course, put more technical fixes to your paper in writing, and probably want to sit down and talk to you a little bit about some biomass industry 101 stuff. Thank you.
Dan Donahue, just let me make a question back to you. Your two main points were focusing on the fuel and the contracting. Now the contracting is CPUC, involvement in that you're asking us to step up for. I'm sorry, focusing on the fuel. What did what did you mean by that? Could somebody get her back a microphone for a second? Wait. Yeah, okay, got it.
Oh, okay, I think actually the two are connected. There needs to be a way to finance getting that fuel to the facilities. The contracts alone may or may not solve that problem, okay. Right? That we need to find some sort of long-term solution to financing, collecting, processing and transporting that fuel and get them to the biomass facilities. The contract is one way to do it. The beneficiaries are the electric ratepayers for a good portion of that, but they're not the only beneficiaries to moving this fuel out of the fields and the forests, and frankly the landfills. The other beneficiaries are frankly the people who breathe in the state of California, okay. And who get a waste management bill every year, should be maybe participating in the benefits of this industry.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, I think just in the queue. So let's see. I've got Nick had the mic, then Art. Let's get the gentleman in front here. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. And then we'll go back to Bill and Gary, and then we'll go over to that side, and then we'll open it up to some of the audio cast to see if we've got any emails. So we'll keep working it.
Hi, good afternoon. Nick Lapis with Californians Against Waste. As you can imagine, we have a lot of comments on pretty much every page of this document, so we will be following up in much more detail. I want to start by really looking back of how far we've come from the passage of AB 32, when we would all show up at ARB workshops, and I think everybody at the Air Board was so focused on tailpipes and smokestacks as far as greenhouse gas emissions, and now we're talking about this comprehensive waste sector plan that's going to involve recycling and composting. That's a huge step forward. I know a lot of us have learned a whole new language in the past 7 years, and I think a lot of the folks at the Air Board have learned about a whole new industry as well. That's definitely positive. As far as specifics in the plan, I'm tempted to go through in detail, but I think that might be a little difficult with this many people here. Let me just hit a few quick highlights. On the manufacturing side, I think we have some great steps in the right direction, but I think we need to take a more industry-specific look. So, what will it take to get the glass sector to use more recycled cullet? What will it take to make the plastic manufacturing industry take more recycled plastic, et cetera? I'm not sure it's one answer for the whole sector, and I think we need to delve into the weeds a little bit further. And I see we have CMTA and other folks in the room, and they should definitely be a part of that. On the organics, I think similarly we have great items listed there. You mentioned several times the idea of phasing out the landfilling of organics, and I think we need to move more aggressively on that. You sort of have it listed as an item that you will consider if legislation and other AB 341 implementation doesn't get you there. But I think we really need to start moving down the road, because some of these phase outs take a few years, and if we're talking about 2020 goals, we need to start working on the regulations now so that we can have a couple years to phase in, and so that we actually achieve the greenhouse gas reductions by 2020. On the landfill gas issues, when the early action measure was being developed, it was always referred to as the phase 1 landfill gas regulation, and there was always talk of doing a phase 2, and I think it's time to go back and pursue that. You mentioned in the report that the concentration at the landfill was set at 500 in the early action measure. The original proposal was 200, but there was strong industry pushback, and the compromise was that they were going to set the standard at 500, but require reporting of all emissions above 200 so that we can include that in phase 2 of the regulation. Well, we've been collecting that data for a couple years now. It's time to see what that looks like, how many emissions we do have between 200 and 500. And especially if we don't move towards phasing out organics, we have to tackle the methane the hard way, which is ratcheting down on the landfill gas system. On the thermal / waste to energy side of things, I think that was probably your biggest misstep in the whole report. All the solutions that you identify in that whole section are really based on making waste energy cheaper, easier, and more readily available. And making any sort of disposal option cheaper, easier, and more readily available will undermine increased recycling and composting, which is the real bang for the buck in greenhouse gas savings. So you're comparing you're focused on comparing landfilling and waste to energy, and I think we could all argue about what's worse. But the real benefits, which you talk about in the rest of the report, are completely ignored in this section. Finally, on the implementation, I'm not sure if I should be happy or disappointed that there are so many items on that list. On one hand, it's great to see such an ambitious agenda, and a lot of the items having such short implementation dates of 2013, 2014. On the other hand, when the list is that long, are these items actually going to get implemented? What's the rulemaking calendar look like for the items on this list? I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Nick, thanks, Nick. Pass it up to Art, and then go ahead. You go ahead, and then Art, you'll be second in the queue.
Good afternoon, Tim Goncharoff, County of Santa Cruz. I just wanted to touch on a couple areas, and the first is to follow up on Nick's comments about methane capture. As was mentioned, a lot of our landfills still don't have methane capture systems. I think they need them. But even of those that do, most of those are last generation technology. A lot of those landfills are still flaring excess methane. Most of our landfills need upgrades to their existing methane capture systems. but that technology is expensive. As was mentioned, this was identified as an early priority target 5 years ago. So it is my hope that as funding becomes available through cap and trade or other resources, that we make this a top priority for grant funding going forward. Secondly, I wanted to say a little more about composting. Both Clark and Paul talked about the importance of streamlining the permitting process. I think that's equally important in the composting area. The permitting process for composting is long and arduous and expensive. A lot of communities don't even attempt it because of that. Some, like my own, have tried and failed. It's very frustrating. As I was searching for language to suggest, I actually found it in the recycling, reuse, and remanufacturing section on page 10, where it suggests work with other agencies, districts, and jurisdictions to identify and address conflicting permitting and regulatory requirements. Develop a model permit that could be used to streamline the permitting process across several agencies, and very importantly, create programmatic EIRs and guidance documents to assist in the completion of environmental review and compliance with CEQA. I'd suggest you just cut and paste that into the composting section. It'd be a great improvement. I wanted to acknowledge your efforts in coordinating between CalRecycle, the Air Board, and the Water Board. I think that's very important. I think there's another agency we need to invite into the process. A lot of our most populous areas are along the coast, and even if the Air and Water Boards and CalRecycle agree to a project, the Coastal Commission can and often does shut projects down. So I think it's very important that they be at the table and be part of this process. And lastly, I wanted to suggest to Kyle and his staff that while the arguments that they've made for composting are good, there's more that could be said. In the absence of composting, what we're using are synthetic fertilizers made from chemicals and hydrocarbons. And those products generate a great deal of greenhouse gases in every stage of their product cycle. So that's another way that composting helps avoid greenhouse gases. And I think even more importantly, perhaps the most powerful tool we have for actually sequestering carbon is improving the health and fertility of our soils. So in that way, using compost provides a kind of multiplier effect that can not only reduce and avoid greenhouse gas emissions, it can actually sequester some of the greenhouse gases that have already been emitted. So I think including those points will create an even stronger case. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And let me respond to that for a minute, but go to Art and then up to the front here, and then we'll go Jack and Gary, Bill, and then people online. Tim's comments, they were somewhat similar to what Rachel Oster said, and I just wanted to point out that we have done one programmatic EIR. That's a funding issue. Some of the issues related to, for example, synthetic fertilizers and the embedded energy there, those are things that we have raised to the air districts, but without quantitative information, it's hard to make that argument. Also, those are things that they have their other statutory drivers for. So that's the calculus of those co-benefits and the trade-offs, and how do you get that into the permitting and local decision-making process. So, I forget where we went. Oh yeah, Art. And then
just two comments, Howard. Arthur Boone from the Northern California Recycling Association. On slide 51, the phrase is uncertainty in landfill emissions. All the data that I've seen so far, it's fairly clear that all of the emissions from the degrading of food materials is long done, long before the gas capture systems are in place. And I have seen no refutation of those claims by those scientists from anybody who is on the landfill gas support side. And I think that uncertainty is a little weak of a word there. I think there's a lot of resistance. You have to remember that IPCC report number 4, everybody on that report on the waste side was had been a landfill apologist in the past. There wasn't a single environmental person on that panel, and there was some terrible things done in that report that have still not been remedied, and there is now some research out there to support that, and I think that I hope that you come out a little bit more in supporting an understanding of that. Second point has to do with items 18 and 19. It's interesting in the, if you look at the amount of material that's actually diverted from the facilities here, we have 48.4 million tons. If you look at the amount of material that's actually used in remanufacturing on panel 19, you have 2.3 million tons. So what that suggests is that all of the recycling that California has ultimately fed into the world's remanufacturing, reprocessing industries has taken place outside of the state. And nobody really wants to deal with the fact that California is an island, as they thought it was 500 years ago, and that all of the stuff comes from other states where the industrial emissions are taking place, or foreign countries. And I think that this agency needs to get out front of the fact that we have deindustrialized California over the last 75 years, and we have moved all the paper plants offshore, out of the state. We've moved the steel and the metal work all out of the state. And so I think that's a large part of our problem today in terms of finding local markets. And one of the big magazines had a thing about remanufacturing in the United States. It's coming back. People are getting interested in it again. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think we have to look at some of the mistakes we've made over the last 50 years and how the world has shifted. Thank you.
And some of that will tie right back into the cross-regulatory permitting issues that several others have raised. So I hear you. So
Yeah,
let's come up front. Hang on a sec. I promised this gentleman numerous times. We'll get you, Jack. I've got a queue here, right up here, Chris, and then we'll go to Jack and Gary, then Bill, then Bill.
And let me, Dan Daniel, let me just respond. Part of the overall message in the overview plan is California taking responsibility for its waste. And that is looking at how do we take responsibility, how do we use that waste here, how do we minimize the amount of materials that we leave for processing outside of California. So that's a long-term overall goal that we need to accomplish here. So we are, broaching that issue, raising that issue about making this, we and all of us in California are responsible for the waste we generate.
Are we on? Great. Since I'm in front and no one can see me, I'll turn around.